Welcome to the Dragonfly Rising podcast. I am your host, Dr. Tammy Dean. Thank you for joining me today as we continue to work together to make a difference. Let's explore how we can use our voice today. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Dragonfly Rising podcast with me, your host, Dr. Tammy Dean. I am so excited today to just bring a little announcement. I've been thinking a lot about this podcast, and it has launched in such an amazing way in 2023. And in 2024, I'm gonna shift it up a little bit. I just wanted to give you a heads up as the listener. I'm going to be moving to, and pray with me and be with me. This is a big task, but I am looking to start posting weekly podcast episodes to really dive into the work around equity in education and thinking about what certain concepts are and how you can start putting those into action inside your classrooms, inside your schools, and really begin facilitating those spaces. But I am, of course, still going to have some guests. So those will be some extras throughout the month, having a guest podcast episode. We'll look and see once or twice a month, kind of get a flow for how it's going, because I absolutely love highlighting and sharing the work that educators are doing in our educational spaces. So I'm really excited about this shift and this change, and please share this podcast with other educators that you know, so our reach and our influence to promote equity in education can be expanded. I am really excited about our episode for today. I want to come back to the basics. I discussed this a little bit in the community episode around awareness and how awareness and equity is really the starting point for this work. And so awareness is really very much like what it sounds like. It is the awareness around yourself. Oftentimes, I have seen in my experience people trying to dig into equity work with the best of intentions, but it really becomes somewhat performative or surface level in that, because really deep and essential equity work begins with yourself and having to do some reflection and interrogation around who you are to start with. Because if we're not having an understanding around self and the different components that make up yourself, it is challenging to really reflect and see and acknowledge what others are experiencing. And to have a really good dialogue, to really move into deeper work where we're looking and analyzing systems and structures, how our own life experience influences our understanding and interpretation and our experience of those systems and structures is really important, because we all come with this intersectionality, right? And intersectionality is just the overlapping of our self and our multitude of identities that frame who we are. So, for example, I identify as a cisgender female. I'm a mother. I'm an educator. I'm an aunt. I'm a daughter. And I could keep going on, right? There's a lot of different identities that I can encapsulate, right? I am a multi-ethnic, multiracial person. And that is actually a really important part, because it influences how I see the world, right? And even in that space, there were challenges with that identity, especially growing up when I did, and I've talked about that too in the Meet Dr. Tammy episode, I also can recognize that I've also come from a space of privilege. The educational environments I had access to, the ability to continue to go to school. But then, at the same time, I was working on my doctorate as a single mom with 2 small children. My kids were 3 and 4 when I was working on my doctorate. And then there's the historical concepts of like a lot of my family, right? So I'm not going to dive in too much around myself, but I share that to give you an example of how there is an intersectionality between all of those pieces. And knowing and identifying all of those parts of my identity really helps me recognize bias as it presents itself in my life and interactions. And I want to take a moment and talk about bias. Okay? Because there's a couple different types, right? There's explicit bias, there's implicit bias, my personal bias. Humans in general, just because of the nature of how we function, we tend to try to categorize. We want to group things because that is part of how we make sense of our world. Okay, so to have bias is to be human. The important piece here is knowing and understanding what my bias is and recognizing it so I can make a change or intentionally counteract that bias. So I may have some explicit bias and you may have some, and I'm not going to, you don't need to tell me here, but right. I want you to think about what that is. And you could recognize it because you can feel the reaction inside yourself when a certain group of someone's, when something happens in a certain way, and your reaction in your person is like, right? No. That's something to attend to because that's potentially a bias. When you start thinking or grouping using they, or I hear this a lot in educational spaces, those kids. Okay, who are those quotes, right? Kids. And if you start noticing how often you say things like that around groups of people, you'll start to notice those biases. Okay. And sometimes those biases are so implicit because they're ingrained given the social, cultural, political atmosphere within which we all live, right? So there are social structures that exist and I'm just going to talk about the United States here for a moment, right? Within the United States. And those systems have influenced how we move and interact with the world. Whether or not we agree with those policies and structures or not, they have influenced us. So, example, colonialism, right, is one of those. Patriarchy is one of those, right? Those systems have influenced us from birth because they exist in the larger society. So you're seeing a lot of pushback around a lot of these systems and structures, okay? And the important part about all of this is I have awareness, I'm starting to reflect and think about myself, and now I'm starting to see and notice and wonder and ask questions about the others around me. So oftentimes, people think colorblindness is the way to go. I hear things like, I don't see color, I see people. I don't care if my students are red, yellow, purple, polka dot, or whatever. And I believe this comes from a good place of intention. And it is something we need to change because colorblindness is not allowing the opportunity to see and acknowledge and interact with the whole person with whom you're speaking about. So if you don't see the racial, ethnic, cultural, social identities of your students or your staff, if you're a leader, or your staff and students, you're not going to be able to really make change. Because all of those pieces of someone's identity is an important and essential component. And my belief around why this exists is because it's uncomfortable. It feels uncomfortable to have some of these conversations because it's counter narrative to the social structures in which you are surrounded by every day. And my task to you is to sit in your discomfort, because part of this work is being uncomfortable, especially if you come from the dominant culture. It's going to feel uncomfortable. And on the other side of discomfort and fear is growth and opportunity. So just a couple things for you to think about. You know, along a close cousin, as I'll call it, of implicit bias are microaggressions. And microaggressions are, you know, and Dr. Kendi says this really well in his books, right? He doesn't like the term microaggressions because they're really not small. They're big. They're big infractions. And it's those microaggressions that show up and you need to start becoming aware of, right? It's how we use language and our words. You know, you may call one certain group of people, oh, they have a strong voice. They're being such a great leader. And then if that same tone, behavior, presence is seen from another group of people, they are disrespectful, they're loud, they're not humble, they don't know when to be quiet, right? They're disruptive. And you see this use of language consistently in schools, out of schools. And so my second challenge to you is to try to notice, interrupt, and shift those microaggressions. Because the noticing and shifting is going to be one of the most important pieces. I talked a little bit about being discomfort, and that is great. It is okay. And sometimes a lot of people try to move through that, and they do a lot of reading and learning and using resources is amazing. And I want you to continue to do that. And as you know, I share multiple books and texts and things like that of authors that are doing this work or are sharing this great work. And if you need some more, please send me a DM and reach out to me, and I'm happy to share some resources with you as well. But reading is great. And I just want to say, and action is the goal. So what are you going to put in action from what you are learning about yourself and awareness? What are you going to put in action as you learn about bias, as you learn about social systems and structures that cause inequities, right? What is the action? And I talk a lot about using your voice and how to use your voice. And I'm gonna give some clear examples in a future episode. So tune in and stay in for that, right? But ask yourself, how does injustice exist around me and in my spaces? So you're gonna name the inequity and the injustice, right? And then we're gonna think about how to take action. So to help you do this, I am actually going to share a free resource out on my Instagram. So please head over to my Instagram, Dragonfly Rising LLC, and find my post, comment, and get the resource to help move through one, awareness around your own identity. So it's going to have some exercises there for you to do that. I will write some common definitions of some of the things I've shared today, just so we're all talking on the same language. An opportunity to reflect and then take action. So I'm going to lay it all out for you, how to start moving through some of the things I've talked about in today's episode. So again, head on over to Dragonfly Rising LLC on Instagram, download your free resource. And if you are interested in learning more or a personalized opportunity to do this work, please connect with me and set up your free discovery call. So it has been such a pleasure talking with you all today. Looking forward to our next episode as we continue to build on our equity work and equity systems. This wraps up another episode of the Dragonfly Rising podcast with me, your host, Dr. Tammy Dean. Thank you so much for joining us. And remember that action is always greater than inaction. How will you use your voice today?